You've been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and suddenly there's a face. Not a real face, obviously, just a pattern in the texture, a confluence of shadows and light that your brain insists looks exactly like someone watching you. You blink, refocus, and it's still there. Maybe it's menacing, maybe it's sad, maybe it's completely neutral but somehow still unsettling. And here's the thing, nobody wants to admit. Part of you wonders if there's something wrong with you for seeing it. You've probably had this experience dozens of times, seeing faces in wood grain, figures in clouds, animals in wallpaper patterns, or that one electrical outlet that definitely looks like it's judging you. Most people shrug it off as a quirk of perception, maybe laugh about it, and move on without giving it a second thought. But what if I told you that dismissing these moments is one of the biggest psychological mistakes you could make? What if those random faces you're seeing aren't random at all, but rather your unconscious mind desperately trying to communicate something that your conscious awareness has been ignoring for years? The phenomenon has a name, pareidolia, derived from the Greek words para, beside, and eidolon, image or form, and it's been studied extensively in psychology and human behavior research for decades. But here's what most articles won't tell you, what most psychologists gloss over because it's too uncomfortable, too revealing. Pareidolia isn't just about seeing faces in the dark. It's about what those faces are telling you about your internal psychological architecture, your unprocessed trauma, your suppressed emotions, and the parts of yourself you've been trying not to see. Well, let me hit you with something that'll either relieve you or disturb you, depending on how you process it. There's nothing wrong with you, but there's everything revealing about you in what you're seeing. This isn't some weird psychology phenomenon that exists just to entertain neuroscience students. It's a diagnostic window into your psyche more powerful than most therapy sessions, and it's been operating in your life every single day without you realizing it. The strange and unusual psychological phenomena here isn't that humans see patterns where none exist. Evolution hardwired us to do exactly that because it kept our ancestors alive. The truly unsettling part is that the specific patterns you see, the emotions you attribute to those patterns, and the intensity of your reactions to ambiguous stimuli are all being dictated by your unconscious mind using archived emotional content you don't even remember storing. When you see faces in the dark, you're not experiencing a perceptual glitch. You're witnessing your brain's pattern completion system pulling from your personal psychological archive and projecting internal reality onto external ambiguity. Research shows that the fusiform face area in your brain activates in just 165 milliseconds when encountering face-like patterns faster than conscious thought, which means pareidolia happens before you can rationalize it. And here's the uncomfortable promise I'm making you. If you actually understand why you see faces in the dark, if you can decode what pareidolia explained properly reveals about your threat detection systems, your unprocessed fears, and your unconscious attempts at communication, you'll unlock direct access to parts of yourself that have been trying to get your attention for years but didn't have any other language to speak. This isn't about being entertained by strange brain quirks. This is about recognizing that every shadow you've ever seen a face in, every cloud that looked like something meaningful, every moment of pareidolia was your psyche speaking in the only symbolic language it has available. So here's what's about to happen. By the end of this, you'll never look at shadows the same way again, because you'll understand they're not showing you what's out there in the darkness. They're showing you what's been hiding in here all along, projected outward in forms you can finally learn to read. The cognitive shadow. When the brain fills in what doesn't exist. You know what's wild? The brain doesn't actually like leaving things unfinished. It's like that friend who can't handle a half-told story. It'll fill in the blanks whether you want it to or not. That's what pareidolia really is when you strip away the fancy terminology. It's your brain acting like an overzealous interior decorator, throwing patterns and meanings onto blank walls that don't need decorating. When you see faces in the dark, you're not experiencing something supernatural or even particularly strange. You're witnessing what psychologists call cognitive shadowing, a mechanism that's been keeping humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years. The thing is, our ancestors didn't have the luxury of second-guessing whether that rustling in the bushes was wind or a predator. Better to assume the worst and survive than shrug it off and become dinner. So the brain evolved to complete patterns frantically, desperately, even when those patterns don't technically exist. It's why you see faces in electrical outlets, animals in cloud formations, and hidden meanings in random static noise. The psychological term pareidolia comes from Greek words meaning beyond image, which is poetic but also brutally accurate. We're constantly seeing beyond what's actually there. This isn't a bug in human cognition. It's a feature that once saved lives, but now creates weird psychology moments, like swearing your coat rack is watching you at 3 a.m. But here's where it gets psychologically darker, and this is something most people don't realize. When you see faces in the dark, you're not just seeing random patterns. You're seeing projections of your internal landscape, fears, anxieties, unresolved emotions that your conscious mind mind refuses to acknowledge. The brain doesn't fear empty space because it's philosophically opposed to nothingness. It fears empty space because emptiness means uncertainty, and uncertainty historically meant death. So your mind fills that void with something, anything, and that something usually reflects what's already lurking in your psychological basement. Think about it. Two people can look at the same ink blot in a Rorschach test and see completely different things. One sees a butterfly, the other sees a monster. The ink blot hasn't changed, but the internal archives each person is pulling from are wildly different. This is pareidolia explained at its core. You're not seeing what's out there, you're seeing what's in here, projected outward like a psychological IMAX screen. The strange and unusual psychological phenomena isn't that we see faces where none exist, it's that those faces are our own shadows, fragments of identity and fear that we've buried so deep. We don't recognize them when they resurface wearing different masks. Let's get practical for a second, because understanding this can genuinely shift how you experience reality. Next time you're lying in bed and you see a face forming in the shadows on your ceiling, try this experiment. Instead of looking away or turning on the light, the usual fear response, sit with it for 30 seconds. Really examine what you're seeing. Ask yourself, what emotion does this face seem to have? Is it angry, sad, threatening, indifferent? Then, and this is the key part, ask yourself if you've been feeling that same emotion lately but haven't let yourself acknowledge it. More often than not, the face in the dark is wearing an expression that mirrors something you've been suppressing. Maybe you're seeing anger because you've been swallowing frustration at work. Maybe you're seeing sadness because you haven't processed a recent loss. This is why pareidolia is such a powerful psychological tool if you know how to use it. The brain completes patterns not randomly, but based on what's emotionally active in your subconscious. It's like your mind is a search engine, and whatever emotional files you've accessed most recently pop up first in the autocomplete, the fusiform face area in your brain, the region specifically designed to detect human faces, activates in just 165 milliseconds when you see face-like patterns, even in total randomness. That's faster than conscious thought, which means pareidolia happens before you can rationalize it away. And here's the thing nobody talks about, but everyone experiences. The brain doesn't just complete visual patterns, it completes social patterns too, emotional patterns, relationship patterns. You see judgment in a neutral expression because your mind is completing a pattern based on past experiences of being judged. You perceive rejection in silence because your brain fills the void with fears you haven't processed. This is the shadow cognitive mechanism extending far beyond why you see faces in the dark. It's operating in every interaction, every interpretation, every moment you assign meaning to ambiguous human behavior. The same neural wiring that makes you see a face in a piece of burnt toast makes you read malice into a delayed text response or see betrayal in a friend's distracted tone. The psychology and human behavior research is clear. Pareidolia isn't just a visual quirk. It's a fundamental lens through which we construct social reality. We walk around completing patterns in other people's intentions, motivations, and feelings the same way we complete patterns in shadows and clouds. Most of the time, we're not responding to what's actually there. We're responding to what our hyperactive pattern completion system tells us is there. And that system, remember, was designed for a world where assuming the worst kept you breathing. In modern life, though, that same system often creates problems that don't exist, sees threats that aren't real, and invents narratives that have nothing to do with reality. The weird psychology of it all is that we're still running ancient survival software in a world that doesn't require it anymore, but the program keeps running anyway, filling blanks, completing patterns, and showing us faces in every shadow. Faces that often look suspiciously like our own hidden fears staring back. The dead file of the mind, sensations that never saw the light. There's this concept in psychology that'll mess with your head if you really sit with it. Your brain stores everything you've ever experienced, but you only have conscious access to maybe 5% of it. The other 95%? It's sitting in what we might call the archive room, a massive psychological warehouse filled with discarded memories, half-formed emotions, sensory impressions you didn't fully process, and fears that never got names. Most people go their entire lives never realizing this archive exists, let alone that it's constantly influencing what they see, feel, and believe about reality. But here's where it connects to pareidolia explained. When you see faces in the dark or patterns in randomness, you're not pulling from your conscious memory bank. You're accessing these archived files, these strange and unusual psychological phenomena that live below the surface of awareness. Your brain is reaching into forgotten drawers, grabbing emotional fragments from experiences you don't remember having, and projecting them onto whatever ambiguous stimulus is in front of you. A shadow, a stain, a cloud, a stranger's expression. This isn't some mystical process. It's documented human behavior, the way the fusiform gyrus and temporal cortex work together to recognize patterns by comparing present stimuli with stored templates. But those templates aren't just visual. They're emotional, trauma-laced desire-soaked archives of everything you felt but never fully processed. Think about it like this. Imagine you're 6 years old and you see a fleeting expression of disappointment cross your father's face. You don't have the emotional vocabulary to process it at that age, so you don't. The moment passes. Life continues. But that micro-expression, that fraction of a second, gets filed away in the archive. 20 years later, you're in a work meeting and your boss has a neutral expression while listening to your presentation. Suddenly, without knowing why, you're convinced they're disappointed in you. That's not paranoia. That's your brain accessing an archived file from 2 decades ago, matching the pattern and completing the emotional narrative before your conscious mind even registers. What's happening? This is pareidolia operating on a psychological level rather than just visual. You're seeing faces in emotional darkness, projecting ancient archived fears onto present moment ambiguity because your brain refuses to leave patterns incomplete. The psychology and human behavior literature calls this perceptual completion or top-down processing, which basically means your brain uses past data to fill in present blanks. The problem? Those past data points were often recorded during moments of stress, confusion, or pain, times when your perception wasn't exactly reliable to begin with. Let's make this practical because recognizing your own archive in action can be genuinely life-changing. Pay attention to your gut reactions to neutral situations over the next week. When someone doesn't text back immediately and you assume they're mad at you, that's an archived pattern completing itself. When you walk into a room of strangers and immediately feel like you don't belong, that's an archived emotional file from probably middle school or earlier being dragged out and projected onto the present. When you look at your reflection in a dim bathroom mirror at night and for just a split second your own face looks wrong, almost threatening, that's your brain pulling from archived self-images, many of which were formed during times when you didn't like yourself very much. Here's a specific exercise. Next time you have a strong negative emotional reaction to something ambiguous, a neutral text, a colleague's tone, your own appearance in weird lighting, pause and ask, when have I felt this exact feeling before? Not just similar, exact. 9 times out of 10 if you sit with the question long enough, a memory will surface, often from childhood or adolescence, where you felt precisely this flavor of inadequacy, rejection, or fear. That's the archived file. That's the template your brain is using to complete the pattern in the present. And once you see the connection, the present situation often loses its emotional charge because you realize you're not responding to what's happening now. You're responding to an echo from the archive, a ghost pattern that has nothing to do with current reality. What makes this particularly weird psychology is that these archived files can be activated by the smallest, most arbitrary triggers. A certain quality of afternoon light reminds your nervous system of a day when something vaguely uncomfortable happened, and suddenly you feel inexplicably anxious without knowing why. A stranger's perfume matches the olfactory signature of someone who once made you feel small, and your stomach tightens in social situations you should be comfortable in. This is why you see faces in the dark that seem to carry specific emotions. Those faces are constructed from archived emotional fragments, sensations that never fully saw the light of conscious processing but remained stored anyway, waiting for pattern recognition systems to pull them out when needed. The human brain processes about 11 million bits of sensory information per second, but your conscious mind can only handle about 40 bits. Where does the rest go? Straight to the archive. And the archive doesn't organize things logically like a library. It clusters them by emotional signature, by intensity, by how much unresolved charge they carry. So when pareidolia activates, when your pattern completion system kicks in, it's not randomly selecting from all possible patterns. It's selecting from the patterns with the strongest emotional tags, the ones that scream loudest from the archive room, the faces that never got fully seen or understood but desperately want recognition. And that's where things get psychologically profound. Maybe what we call pareidolia, seeing faces where none exist, is actually the psyche's attempt to finally bring those archived sensations into the light, to give form to formless emotional data, to complete patterns that were left painfully, dangerously incomplete years or decades ago. The instinct of the wounded hunter, why we see danger where there is none. Here's something you probably know on an intellectual level but haven't fully absorbed. Your brain is still running software designed for the African savanna 200,000 years ago. Back then, the humans who survived weren't the optimistic ones who gave every rustling bush the benefit of the doubt. They were the paranoid ones, the hyper-vigilant ones, the ones who saw 10 false predators for every real one and lived to reproduce because of it. That's the evolutionary foundation of pareidolia explained. It's a biological alarm system, calibrated to prefer false positives over false negatives. Better to see a face in the shadows that isn't there than miss the one that is. This makes perfect sense when you're a hunter-gatherer and actual predators are trying to eat you. But in modern life, this same mechanism creates strange and unusual psychological phenomena where we're constantly seeing social predators, emotional threats, and relationship dangers that don't actually exist. The psychology and human behavior research is clear on this. We haven't evolved new brains for Instagram, emails, and workplace politics. We're using ancient threat detection software in environments it was never designed for. So when you see faces in the dark, you're witnessing a survival mechanism that once saved lives, but now mostly creates anxiety, misunderstandings, and conflicts that didn't need to happen. Your brain is still hunting for predators, except now the predators are ambiguous text messages, neutral facial expressions in Zoom, meetings, and imagined judgments from strangers who aren't even thinking about you. The term researchers use for this is threat bias or negativity bias, the brain's tendency to prioritize negative information over positive, danger over safety, loss over gain. Studies show that humans process negative stimuli faster and more thoroughly than positive stimuli, dedicating more neural resources to potential threats than potential rewards. This is pareidolia operating on an emotional frequency. Your pattern completion system isn't neutral. It's weighted heavily toward detecting danger, even when danger isn't remotely present. Think about your own life for a second. When you walk into a party and scan the room, your brain doesn't highlight all the neutral or friendly faces. It zeroes in on the one person who might be looking at you funny. When you receive 10 compliments and 1 criticism, which one do you ruminate on for the next 3 days? The criticism, obviously, because your threat detection system flags it as survival critical information while dismissing the compliments as irrelevant background noise. This is the wounded hunter instinct in action. You're not scanning for predators anymore. You're scanning for social rejection, professional failure, emotional abandonment, modern versions of ancient threats. And just like pareidolia makes you see faces where none exist, threat bias makes you see malice, judgment, and danger in interactions that were actually neutral or even positive. You're completing patterns based on worst-case scenarios because, evolutionarily speaking, that's what kept your ancestors breathing. Let's get uncomfortably specific about how this plays out in daily life, because recognizing it can literally change your relationships and mental health. Next time you're in a conversation and someone pauses before responding, notice your immediate internal reaction. For most people, that pause triggers a micro-panic. They're thinking of how to reject what I just said, or they're judging me, or I said something wrong. That's your wounded hunter instinct completing a threat pattern in real time. The pause was probably just them collecting their thoughts, but your brain doesn't wait for confirmation. It fills the ambiguity with threat because ambiguity is dangerous. Here's a practical exercise you can do this week. Keep a log of every time you assume someone is mad at you, disappointed in you, or judging you. Write down the evidence you're using to support that assumption. 9 times out of 10, you'll notice the evidence is absurdly thin. A delayed response, a neutral expression, a slightly different tone. That's pareidolia on a social level. You're seeing emotional faces in behavioral shadows, completing threat patterns based on minimal data because your brain is wired to assume the worst. Now here's the kicker. After you log these assumptions, follow up and check if they were accurate. Ask the person directly, if appropriate, or simply wait and see how things unfold. You'll be shocked, maybe disturbed, by how often you were completely wrong, how many threats you invented that had zero basis in reality. The wounded hunter in you is creating enemies that don't exist, conflicts that aren't happening, and rejections that nobody intended. And this is where the weird psychology gets truly dark. The more you've been genuinely hurt in the past, the more sensitive your threat detection system becomes. It's like a smoke alarm that's been triggered too many times. Eventually it starts going off when you toast bread. If you grew up in an emotionally unstable environment, your brain learned that ambiguity equals danger, that neutral expressions might precede explosions, that silence often came before storms. So now, as an adult, your pattern completion system is hyperactive, seeing threats in situations that genuinely safe people wouldn't even register as concerning. This is why you see faces in the dark that carry such specific malice. They're not random. They're templates built from past wounds. The psychology and human behavior literature calls this trauma-informed perception or learned hypervigilance. Your brain isn't malfunctioning when it sees danger everywhere. It's functioning exactly as it learned to function when danger was everywhere in your personal history. The problem is that past environments aren't present reality, but your wounded hunter doesn't know that. It just knows that survival once depended on assuming every shadow had teeth. So you walk through life completing patterns toward threat, seeing faces in emotional darkness that mirror the faces you needed to watch for years ago, projecting archived fears onto present moment ambiguity because your alarm system never got the memo that the war is over. The pareidolia explained here isn't just about visual tricks. It's about how trauma rewires threat detection, how past pain distorts present perception, how the instinct that once saved you now sabotages connection, intimacy, and peace. And the truly strange and unusual psychological phenomena. Most people running hyperactive threat systems don't even realize they're doing it. They genuinely believe the world is as dangerous as their perception suggests, never recognizing that they're seeing through lenses ground down by by old wounds, completing patterns that haven't been relevant for years, but keep playing on infinite loop. The hidden face of the self, the unconscious that sculpts invisible images. Here's where things get truly unsettling, and most psychology textbooks won't tell you this directly, but the evidence is overwhelming. When you see faces in the dark, you're not just seeing random neural misfires, you're witnessing your unconscious mind attempting communication through the only language it has available. The unconscious doesn't speak in words, it speaks in symbols, sensations, images, and yes, faces that appear where they shouldn't. This is pareidolia explained at its deepest psychological level. The pattern completion system isn't just filling blanks randomly, it's being directed by unconscious content that's trying desperately to surface, to be seen, to be acknowledged. Think about dream symbolism for a moment. Freud and Jung both recognized that the unconscious communicates through images because direct verbal access is blocked. The same mechanism operates when you're awake but encountering ambiguous stimuli. That stain on the ceiling that looks like a face, that shadow that seems menacing, those aren't accidents of perception. They're the unconscious using pareidolia as a canvas, painting emotional states and repressed content onto neutral surfaces because it has no other way to get your attention. The weird psychology here is that most people experience this constantly but never recognize it for what it is. A kind of waking dream, a symbolic language being spoken by parts of yourself you've exiled from conscious awareness. Research into face pareidolia specifically shows something remarkable. The faces people see in objects often carry emotional expressions, and those expressions aren't random. Studies where participants viewed ambiguous objects with face-like features found that people consistently attributed specific emotions, ages, and even genders to these illusory faces. But here's the kicker. The emotions people most commonly attributed corresponded closely with their own emotional states at the time of viewing. If you're anxious, the face in the wood grain looks threatening. If you're depressed, it looks sad or empty. If you're angry but suppressing it, suddenly every shadow has hostile intent. This is psychology and human behavior, operating at a level most people never examine. Your internal emotional landscape is being projected outward and given form through pareidolia. The unconscious doesn't just passively wait for you to notice it. It actively sculpts your perception, using your brain's pattern recognition systems to create images that reflect what's happening in the psychological basement. Those faces you see where none exist, they're wearing expressions you're not letting yourself feel, carrying emotions you've judged as unacceptable, embodying aspects of self you've denied or disowned. The pareidolia isn't external, it's internal content finding. External expression, like steam escaping from a pressure valve. Let's make this actionable because recognizing your unconscious in pareidolia can be psychologically transformative. Over the next few days, pay attention to what you see in ambiguous stimuli, clouds, shadows, stains, textures, and specifically note the emotional quality of what you perceive. Don't dismiss it as random. Treat it like a Rorschach test, which is exactly what it is. If you see threatening faces, ask yourself, what am I afraid of right now that I'm not admitting? If you see sad faces, ask, what grief am I carrying that I won't let surface? This isn't pseudoscience. Neuroscience research shows that emotional states directly influence perceptual processing, particularly in face recognition areas of the brain. Your fusiform gyrus and amygdala don't just passively process visual input, they're actively influenced by limbic system activity, which is where emotions live. So when you're anxious, your threat detection networks are hyperactive, literally shaping what patterns you complete and how you interpret them. Here's a specific exercise from depth psychology. Next time you see a particularly vivid example of pareidolia, a face in a tree, a figure in the clouds, sit with it and ask, if this image could speak, what would it say to me? Then listen, not for actual voices, that would be something else entirely, but for the emotional response that arises, the thoughts that surface, the memories that bubble up. 9 times out of 10, you'll discover that the face you're seeing is connected to something you've been avoiding thinking about, some part of your internal experience you've been trying not to see. The truly strange and unusual psychological phenomena here is that your unconscious is smarter than you think. It knows exactly how to use your brain's architecture against you in the most productive way possible. It can't force you to consciously acknowledge repressed content, but it can hijack pareidolia to project that content externally, making the internal visible in a way that bypasses your psychological defenses. This is why people throughout history have seen religious figures in toast, deceased loved ones in clouds, demons in shadows, not because those things are actually there, but because the unconscious uses culturally available symbols and personally significant images to communicate through the pareidolic channel. The face you see isn't random, it's carefully selected from your personal archive of significant faces, emotional templates, and archetypal images that carry meaning for you. Specifically, when you see faces in the dark, you're essentially looking at a mirror of your own psyche, distorted and projected outward, but fundamentally reflecting internal reality rather than external. This is pareidolia Pareidolia explained not as perceptual error, but as psychological communication, the language of the self talking to the self, using shadows and ambiguity as the medium because direct conversation has been blocked. And the most profound implication of this, the world you perceive isn't nearly as objective as you think. Every ambiguous stimulus you encounter becomes a canvas for unconscious projection, a screen onto which hidden parts of yourself are constantly being displayed. You're not just walking through physical reality, you're walking through a landscape populated by your own psychological ghosts, wearing whatever faces the unconscious decides to give them in that moment. The psychology and human behavior research makes this clear. Perception is never pure. It's always filtered, always shaped, always influenced by what's lurking below conscious awareness, waiting for any opportunity, a shadow, a stain, a moment of ambiguity, to rise up and be seen, even if just for a second, before you dismiss it as just pareidolia and move on without recognizing that you just glimpsed yourself in the darkness. So here's where you are right now. You've just learned that every shadow you've stared at, every cloud that looked meaningful, every moment you saw a face in the dark, wasn't some random neural misfire. It was your unconscious mind speaking in the only symbolic language it has available. You understand now that pareidolia explained properly isn't just weird psychology trivia. It's a diagnostic window showing you exactly what emotional content you've been archiving, what threats your hypervigilant system is scanning for, and what parts of yourself are desperately trying to surface and be seen. The psychology and human behavior research is overwhelming on this. Your perception isn't neutral, it's loaded with projection, and every ambiguous stimulus you encounter becomes a canvas for unconscious communication. But here's the question that matters now. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to keep dismissing those moments as meaningless quirks, or are you finally going to start listening to what your psyche has been trying to tell you through every strange and unusual psychological phenomena you've experienced? Think about it. When was the last time you saw something in shadows that genuinely unsettled you, and instead of looking away, you sat with it and asked what part of yourself that image was reflecting? When was the last time you recognized that the threats you keep seeing in neutral situations aren't actually out there? They're archived patterns from past wounds that your brain keeps completing because you've never processed the original injury. This isn't theoretical anymore. This is actionable intelligence about how your mind works, and the only question is whether you're brave enough to use it. Let me challenge you directly, because if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants more than surface-level understanding. Over the next 7 days, every time you experience pareidolia, every face in texture, every pattern in randomness, every moment of seeing something where nothing exists, treat it like a message. Write down what you saw, what emotion it carried, and what you were thinking about or feeling just before it appeared. Do this consistently, and I guarantee you'll start seeing patterns in the patterns, connections between your emotional state and what your unconscious projects outward. You'll realize that why you see faces in the dark isn't a mystery at all. It's a systematic communication attempt that you've been ignoring your entire life. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people won't do this exercise because facing what the shadows actually reveal about their internal landscape is scarier than just dismissing it as weird brain stuff. But you're not most people, are you? You're someone who recognizes that self-knowledge, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only path to actually changing the patterns that run your life. So I'm asking you point blank, are you going to keep living on autopilot, letting archived fears and unprocessed emotions dictate what you see and how you respond? Or are you going to start using pareidolia as the psychological tool it actually is, a direct line to parts of yourself that have been trying to get your attention for years? The choice is yours, but understand this. The faces you see in the dark aren't going anywhere. They'll keep appearing, keep projecting, keep trying to communicate until you finally acknowledge what they're showing you about yourself. Now, if you found this valuable, if understanding the psychology and human behavior behind why you see faces in the dark genuinely shifted something in how you perceive reality, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because this is just the beginning of understanding how your unconscious operates, how perception shapes reality, and how strange and unusual psychological phenomena are actually keys to self-knowledge most people never access. We're diving deeper into the weird psychology that controls your life without you realizing it, and trust me, Pareidolia Explained is just the surface layer. Every week we're unpacking mechanisms like this, the hidden patterns, the unconscious drivers, the psychological architecture that's been running your decisions, relationships, and emotional reactions since childhood. So subscribe, activate those notifications, and become part of a community that's done with surface-level understanding and ready to see what's actually operating beneath conscious awareness. And drop a comment right now. What's the most vivid example of pareidolia you've ever experienced? And after reading this, what do you think it was trying to tell you about your internal state? Let's compare notes and see what patterns emerge in the community, because the more we share these experiences, the more we realize we're all walking around seeing our own own psychological shadows projected onto the world, and it's time we learn to read what they're saying. See you in the next one, where we're going even deeper into how your mind constructs the reality you think is objective. That's how weird psychology can transform into practical wisdom. What if you made this a daily practice? For 1 week, note every odd pattern or face that pops into your vision. Record the feeling it triggers, the thoughts that arise, and what was happening in your life that day. Share one of your discoveries in the comments. Did any pattern reveal a truth or remind you of a moment from your past? When you realize that everything your mind renders is a clue about you, growth comes faster and more deeply than you might expect. This is the kind of hidden knowledge that most people miss by staying on the surface. Now, if you found yourself nodding along, surprised or even a little uneasy by how much your strange perceptions can reveal, don't keep this journey to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and tell someone about these human mysteries. What do you see and what do you think it means? Drop your story in the comments and let's map the shadows of our own minds together. You never know, the next insight that transforms your understanding of life could start with the next face you see in the dark.